The invitation came in an envelope so fancy that it practically glittered in the dull light of our kitchen. My wife, Melanie, was already beaming when she tore it open, her fingers tingling with excitement. I watched her, amused, as she skimmed through the card, her face lighting up with each word. She was like a kid on Christmas morning, her eyes wide and glimmering. "It's from the London office," she squealed, barely containing her excitement. "The annual retreat. They're hosting it in Italy this year." For months, Melanie had been gunning for a transfer to the European branch, a dream she'd held onto for years. She'd talked about it constantly, fantasizing about the beautiful, historic streets of Europe, the chance to work alongside a new set of colleagues, and immerse herself in the culture. As a senior marketing consultant, she was great at her job. The only thing missing was the right opportunity to push her to that next level, the kind of recognition she knew she deserved. "Are you excited?" I asked, grinning as I watched her practically dance around the kitchen. "Oh, you have no idea." She spun around to face me, her cheeks flushed. "This could be it, Andrew. This could be my chance." I pulled her into a hug, and for a moment, we were caught in the excitement together. She hugged me back tightly, whispering, "Thank you for always supporting me." But as the retreat approached, I started to notice the slight shifts in Melanie's behavior. Little things at first, a few extra trips to the salon, late nights spent preparing for the trip, checking and double-checking her wardrobe choices. She was unusually tense, a far cry from the calm and collected Melanie I knew so well. I chalked it up to nerves, convinced that the pressure of making a good impression in front of the international team was weighing on her. The day finally arrived, and I drove her to the airport. She was practically buzzing with excitement, her suitcase wheeling behind her as she leaned over to give me a quick kiss goodbye. "I'll call you as soon as I land," she said, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "I love you." As I watched her walk through the airport doors, a pang of unease tugged at my chest. I dismissed it, though, laughing at myself for feeling jittery. She was going on a work trip, a few days in Italy surrounded by her colleagues. What was there to worry about? Little did I know, that was the beginning of the unraveling. What started as a work retreat in Italy would turn into a nightmare that would tear apart the very fabric of our marriage, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd loved for over a decade. Melanie's calls started off frequent and cheerful, her voice alive with stories of the Italian countryside, the breathtaking villa where the retreat was held, and the Italian food she couldn't stop raving about. I could hear the excitement, even the awe, in her voice as she described the beauty of the place. The sprawling vineyards, the view of the hills stretching on for miles, the warm Italian sun casting a golden glow over everything. But as the days went by, the calls became less frequent. At first, I didn't think much of it. Melanie was probably busy with team-building activities, workshops, and dinners with her colleagues. But when 2 days passed with nothing but brief, late-night texts, I began to worry. Then, on the third day, she finally called. It was late for her, nearly 1 a.m. in Italy, and I could hear the faint hum of music and laughter in the background. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice lower than usual, almost hesitant. "Hey." I was starting to worry. "Everything okay?" I tried to keep my tone light, but I couldn't hide the concern completely. "Oh yes. Sorry. I've just been so busy. Non-stop meetings, workshops. You know how these things are." "Sounds intense," I replied, though I felt a pang of unease at how distracted she sounded. "Yeah, it's been amazing though. I've met so many brilliant people from the London office. You wouldn't believe the kind of minds they have here." "Glad to hear it," I said, though something about the way she said it struck me as off. Her voice was animated but detached, like she was talking to a stranger instead of her husband. "Who's in charge of the retreat?" I asked, hoping to ease my discomfort by hearing more about her work. "Oh, Lorenzo is heading it up," she said casually. "He's one of the senior partners. A real visionary, they say. He's been with the company forever, and everyone here just adores him." I could feel my jaw clench, an involuntary reaction to the admiration in her voice. "I've heard his name before, right? Wasn't he on that project you helped with last year?" "Yes, exactly," she replied, a little too eagerly. He's just as impressive in person. There's this energy about him. I can see why everyone's so captivated by him. A silence stretched between us, and I didn't know how to break it. I wasn't the type to feel jealous. I trusted Melanie. She'd never given me any reason not to. But as I hung up that night, there was an unsettled feeling gnawing at me, something I couldn't shake. When Melanie came home a week later, she seemed different. The usual warmth in her eyes was there, but it felt reserved, distant. She was exhausted, she claimed, and who could blame her? I tried not to push her for details, knowing she needed time to settle back into our life. But then, over the next few weeks, things began to change. For one, her phone was practically glued to her hand. She'd never been the kind of person to be secretive, yet I'd catch her smiling at her screen, only to quickly tuck it away when she noticed I was looking. She'd laugh at texts she wouldn't explain, brushing off my questions with a vague, "Oh, just something funny from the work group chat." As time passed, her evenings became mysteriously occupied. Out of nowhere, she started working late, at least twice a week, an unusual commitment for her. Each time, she'd tell me it was for a last-minute project or that she needed some quiet time to focus. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But a familiar unease started building in my chest, a feeling I couldn't ignore. One night, after she left for one of her late work sessions, I decided to drive to her office, hoping to surprise her with a coffee and maybe ease the tension that had been growing between us. When I got there, though, I was met with an empty office and a locked door. The security guard on duty recognized me and greeted me with a puzzled look. "Looking for Melanie?" he asked. "Yeah, she's supposed to be working late tonight. Figured I'd bring her some coffee." I tried to keep my voice light, but I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening. "She left hours ago," he replied, scratching his head. "I remember seeing her head out around 7. My heart sank. 7? That was hours ago. If she wasn't at the office, where was she? I drove home, my mind racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. When she finally came home later that night, her face lit up in surprise as she found me sitting on the couch, waiting. "Oh, you're still up?" she said, her voice too casual, too smooth. "Yeah, thought I'd stay up for you." I watched her carefully, noting the faint blush on her cheeks, the way she hesitated before stepping into the room. She gave me a nervous smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's been a long night. I'm exhausted. I'm just going to head to bed." I wanted to ask her outright where she'd been, to demand the truth, but the words caught in my throat. I watched her disappear into the bedroom, feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. And that's when I decided I had to know the truth, no matter what. For the next few days, I kept my suspicions to myself, but every time I looked at Melanie, I felt a mix of love, doubt, and fear that I couldn't shake. It was as if I were staring at someone I barely knew, despite having been by her side for years. Then one Friday, while she was in the shower, I couldn't resist the urge any longer. Her phone lay on the nightstand, screen glowing faintly with a notification that flashed briefly before fading to black. My heart raced as I reached for it, a flood of guilt and dread churning in my stomach. But I needed to know. My hands shook as I unlocked it. I hated that I was doing this, that I was doubting the woman I'd loved for over a decade, but my instincts were screaming at me. And as I scrolled through her messages, I found exactly what I'd feared. There, near the top of her chats, was a thread with Lorenzo tagged with little emojis, wine glasses, fireworks, a heart. I opened the chat, dreading what I might find. Their conversation started innocently enough. They'd exchanged work updates, shared some harmless jokes. But as I scrolled further, I noticed the messages growing, flirtatious. I read words I'd never seen Melanie use before, teasing comments, late-night messages that grew bolder, more familiar. I felt a deep pang in my chest, a mixture of hurt and betrayal boiling up inside me. Then, there it was, a message from Lorenzo, sent the night she'd supposedly worked late. "Tonight was unforgettable. I'll be thinking about it all weekend. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach dropped. Every shred of doubt I'd held on to evaporated. It was all real. My wife, my Melanie, was having an affair. Just as I was processing this, I heard the water turn off in the bathroom. Panic surged through me. I quickly put her phone back where I'd found it and darted to the kitchen, hoping my face wouldn't betray the turmoil twisting inside me. I heard her footsteps as she came down the hall, her voice light and cheerful. "You wouldn't believe the week I've had," she called out, as if nothing were wrong, as if she hadn't just shattered my world without even knowing it. I forced myself to play along, to nod and smile as she went on about her day, the ache in my chest growing sharper with every casual word she spoke. But that night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I lay wide awake, my mind racing. I needed to know more. I needed to understand how far this had gone, what it meant to her, if she was planning to leave me. I couldn't bear the thought of losing her, but I also couldn't fathom the depth of her betrayal. Over the next few days, I became a man on a mission, scouring her phone whenever I could and piecing together the story, bit by bit. I read through more messages, small exchanges hinting at late-night meetups, secret moments they'd shared. The details were vague, but the emotions behind them were clear. She was smitten. I could feel it in every word, every punctuation mark. The hardest part was that she was still coming home to me every night, looking me in the eyes, pretending everything was normal. She'd lean in to kiss me goodbye in the mornings, the same way she always had, only now I could practically smell the lies on her breath. One afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. I'd been gathering evidence, filling my head with every damning message, every sickening detail. I was done with the guessing, the doubt. I wanted to confront her, so I planned a weekend away. I suggested a getaway to our favorite cabin by the lake, a place we hadn't visited in years but had once meant the world to us. It was where I'd proposed, where we'd spent anniversaries, shared secrets, planned dreams. It seemed like the perfect place to lay it all out, to face whatever was left of our marriage. When I suggested it, Melanie's face lit up with that familiar, warm smile, the one that had made me fall in love with her all those years ago. She readily agreed, her excitement genuine, or at least convincing. As we packed, she hummed to herself, stuffing a bag with blankets, a bottle of wine, and our favorite snacks, like we were setting off on a romantic weekend. But for me, this trip wasn't about rekindling anything. It was about facing the truth. As we pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin, nestled among trees that stretched up to the sky, a sense of finality settled over me. I glanced at Melanie as she smiled out the window, taking in the lake view. I knew I was about to throw a grenade into our carefully constructed life, and there would be no going back. Once we were inside, I suggested we open the wine. She laughed, kicking off her shoes and curling up on the couch, looking at me with a warm smile, as if this were any other romantic getaway. We talked for a while, about nothing important, both of us avoiding the weight in the room. But finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I set my glass down and looked her square in the eyes. "Melanie, I know about you and Lorenzo." The smile on her face froze. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw panic flash across her face before she quickly tried to mask it, but it was too late. She knew she was caught. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She simply stared at me, stunned, as the silence stretched between us like a chasm. "What are you talking about?" she finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, though we both knew she was only stalling. "You've been seeing him," I said, my voice even, surprising myself with my calm. "I saw the messages. I know everything." Her face went pale, her hands clutching the edge of the couch as if she were bracing for an impact. "Andrew," she began, her voice thick with emotion. It's complicated." "Oh, I'm sure it is," I replied, the bitterness in my voice cutting through the room. "Complicated enough to keep you lying to me, sneaking around, pretending everything was fine while you were seeing him behind my back?" She closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Please, let me explain." "Explain?" I nearly laughed. "What's left to explain, Melanie? I've seen the messages. I know exactly what's been happening." She reached for my hand, her fingers trembling as she tried to grasp it, but I pulled away, the anger and hurt too raw to let her touch me. "Andrew, I never wanted to hurt you," she said, her voice breaking. I don't even know how it happened. I was caught up in the moment, in the excitement of being somewhere new, with someone who saw me differently. It was like I was living another life, one I didn't think I'd ever have a chance to experience. I never meant for it to go this far. I stared at her, my heart hammering in my chest, and the rage simmering beneath the surface threatened to consume me. I had loved this woman, given her everything, and she had taken it all and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Andrew, I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air like a heavy fog. I stared at her, feeling the weight of our broken marriage pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could have yelled, could have stormed out of the cabin, but instead, I just sat there, numb, the enormity of her betrayal finally settling over me. Is he worth it? I asked finally, my voice barely audible. Her face crumpled, but she said nothing, the silence telling me everything I needed to know. I drove us home from the cabin in silence, the miles stretching out endlessly, the air thick with tension. Melanie barely looked at me, her face turned toward the window, eyes glazed with unshed tears. I could feel the weight of the words we hadn't spoken, the questions left unanswered. In my mind, our life together played in painful flashes, our wedding, the vacations, the quiet nights we'd spent just being together. I kept wondering what had happened to that Melanie, the woman I thought I'd known, the one I'd built a life with. Over the next few days, we barely spoke. Melanie stayed quiet, almost distant, and I buried myself in work, hoping that distraction might dull the ache gnawing at me. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I felt. It wasn't enough to know that she'd been with him. I wanted to understand the full story, the extent of her betrayal. And with each unanswered question, my resolve hardened. Then, one afternoon, when I knew Melanie would be at work, I found myself driving to her office building. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. Maybe some small piece of evidence, or perhaps just the satisfaction of seeing the place where it had all happened. The betrayal had burned a hole in me, and I needed answers to fill it, even if they hurt. As I pulled into the parking lot, my heart pounded. The building loomed over me, its glass facade reflecting the clouded sky. I felt out of place, like an intruder in her world. But as I walked through the lobby, I spotted someone I recognized, Melanie's friend and colleague, Sarah. She was waiting by the elevator, scrolling through her phone, and didn't notice me until I was nearly beside her. "Oh, Andrew." She looked up, surprised, and quickly put on a smile. "What brings you here?" I paused, scrambling for a believable excuse. "I was just dropping something off for Melanie," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Is she around?" She hesitated, her face flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Not today. She's working remotely, I think. It's just that her department's been really busy, and they've been juggling things a lot lately." The slight awkwardness in her tone piqued my curiosity. I forced a smile. That must be tough, keeping up with all these new projects. Sarah nodded, her smile looking forced. "It's been a lot, yeah. Especially with Lorenzo here from the London office. He's had everyone scrambling." She paused, then added carefully, "I'm guessing you've heard of him by now?" The question was innocent enough, but the way she looked at me, like she was searching for something in my face, sent a chill down my spine. "Yeah," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "He seems dedicated." Sarah laughed, but it was tinged with discomfort. Dedicated is one word for it. The man doesn't stop, day or night. He's always throwing out new ideas, sending out emails at all hours. He's, let's just say, intense. She shifted slightly, glancing toward the elevator. "Anyway, I'm sure it's nothing you haven't heard from Melanie." I forced a polite nod, even though a storm of thoughts was swirling in my mind. Sarah's words weren't the standard friendly chit-chat. There was something unsaid, something she was skirting around. "Well, I better get going," she said, offering me a quick smile before stepping into the elevator. "It was good seeing you, Andrew." I watched her disappear behind the closing doors, my mind racing. It sounded as though she knew something, or at least suspected it, but she'd held back. And as I left the building, an idea formed in my mind. I needed more than just Melanie's side of the story. I needed to find a way into her messages, into her world, the world she was so carefully hiding from me. That night, When Melanie finally went to bed, I quietly made my way to her office in the corner of our home. She had a company laptop, one she always kept in her work bag. I'd noticed it in there when she left it by the front door. She'd taken to keeping her phone with her constantly, but her laptop, she never worried about me checking it. Taking a deep breath, I powered it up. I told myself that this was the only way, that I couldn't live with these doubts hanging over me. And as the screen flickered to life, I knew there was no turning back. I navigated through her files and emails, my hands trembling slightly. For a while, there was nothing incriminating. Just work emails, client reports, harmless exchanges. But just as I was starting to feel foolish, I found an email buried deep in a folder titled Drafts. It was from her to Lorenzo, but it hadn't been sent. I opened it, feeling a knot tighten in my chest as I scanned the words. Lorenzo, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even recognize myself anymore. I love Andrew. I always have, and I still do. But you made me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in years. I don't know how to stop this, how to let you go, but I know I can't keep lying to him forever. I wish things were different. I wish I could go back and make a different choice. The email trailed off, unfinished. It was raw, revealing, and utterly heartbreaking. As I sat there, staring at the screen, a sick realization washed over me. Melanie hadn't just cheated out of impulse or boredom. She'd fallen for this man, for the life he represented. She wanted to be with him, but something was holding her back. Guilt, obligation, maybe even love for me. But in the end, it didn't matter. She'd still chosen to betray me, to risk everything we had for a fleeting moment of passion. And as the anger built within me, I realized something else. I had a way to get into her messages now. Her laptop was. I opened her messaging app, holding my breath as I waited for the chat history to load. There it was. A full record of every conversation, every hidden moment they'd shared. I read message after message, each one a new stab in my chest. Their conversations were full of confessions, half-joking plans to run away together, plans to meet up, secret late-night rendezvous. They'd shared stories, private jokes, talked about dreams and regrets, and even discussed what their lives would look like if they weren't bound by commitments. And then I saw it, a mention of an upcoming business trip. In just a few days, Melanie and Lorenzo would be flying out to a conference in Chicago, an entire weekend together, conveniently disguised as work. I sat there, my mind spinning. This was the proof I needed. But beyond that, it was an opportunity. I closed her laptop and returned it to her bag, my mind racing with a plan that had begun to form, a plan for revenge. I would give her one last chance to come clean. I wanted to look her in the eyes and ask, just once more, if there was anything she wanted to tell me. And if she lied, if she dared to betray me one last time, I'd have the perfect way to expose her and make her pay for everything she put me through. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I greeted Melanie with a soft kiss on the cheek and even made her favorite coffee, all while the anger simmered quietly beneath my calm exterior. She seemed relieved by my sudden warmth, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. For the next few days, I watched her carefully, noting the way she responded to my gestures, the way her smile seemed genuine yet tinged with a certain distance. I could tell she thought the tension between us was dissipating, that perhaps the awkwardness from our cabin trip had been left behind. But I was just waiting, giving her the chance to come clean, though each passing day chipped away at what little hope I had left. Finally, the day of her trip arrived. I was waiting by the door as she zipped up her suitcase, a slight air of guilt flickering across her face when she saw me. "You know I hate leaving you behind," she murmured, reaching for my hand. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "I get it. It's work," I said, my voice almost too casual. "Besides, it's only a few days, right?" She smiled, relaxing. "Exactly. I'll be back before you know it." She squeezed my hand, her fingers warm against mine. But as she started to pull away, I tightened my grip, holding her in place. "Melanie," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded with anticipation. "Is there anything you want to tell me? About anything?" Her face froze, her eyes widening just a fraction before she quickly composed herself, giving me a look that was almost playful. No, silly. It's just work. You don't need to worry. I forced a smile, releasing her hand. Of course. I just wanted to hear it from you. But as I let her go, the last trace of trust I'd been clinging to evaporated. I watched her drive away, feeling an odd sense of calm. There was no more doubt, no more wondering. She'd made her choice, and now it was my turn. Once Melanie was gone, I set my plan into motion. I'd taken the day off from work, claiming an urgent personal matter, and drove directly to the airport. I'd already booked a last-minute ticket to Chicago, taking a flight scheduled to arrive a few hours after hers. I knew exactly where she'd be staying, thanks to a small slip in one of her messages with Lorenzo. They'd both be checked into the Grand Marquette Hotel downtown, under the guise of a corporate meeting conveniently arranged by their employer. I arrived in Chicago just as dusk was beginning to settle over the city, casting a hazy glow over the skyline. I made my way to the hotel and checked in, requesting a room with a view of the city, a detail Melanie had always admired on our past trips. The receptionist handed me my key, and I made my way up to my room, my pulse racing as I entered and shut the door behind me. For hours, I waited, biding my time as I mentally prepared for what was coming. I knew their room number, 615, just a few floors above mine, and I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes until the right moment. Finally, around 9 p.m., I left my room and made my way upstairs, taking my time as I navigated the hallways. When I reached room 615, I stopped in front of the door, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might echo in the corridor. The "Do Not Disturb" sign hung from the handle, mocking me, daring me to knock, but I had something better in mind. I pulled out my phone, quickly dialing her number. I held my breath as it rang, and a moment later, I heard her voice on the other end, breathless, as if she'd been caught off guard. "Andrew?" she answered, sounding surprised. "Hey, I just wanted to check in," I said, keeping my tone light. "How's the conference?" There was a slight pause. "Oh, it's great," she replied, her voice a bit too enthusiastic. "Just really busy. Lots of people, lots of sessions. You know how these things are." I could hear a faint rustling in the background, followed by a low murmur. Lorenzo's voice. The sound sent a surge of anger through me, but I kept my cool. "Are you in your room?" I asked, the hint of a challenge in my voice. "You sound distracted." "Oh, no. Yes, I just stepped out for a quick break. Networking, you know?" She forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow, strained. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Well, I just wanted to say good night," I said softly, a bitter smile spreading across my face. "Tell Lorenzo I say hi." The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically hear her mind racing, scrambling to come up with a response. But I didn't give her the chance. I ended the call, slipping my phone back into my pocket, and took a moment to let the satisfaction sink in. Now, it was time for the final part of my plan. I made my way to the front desk, pulling out the paperwork I'd printed back home, a packet full of screenshots of their messages, details of their rendezvous, their plans. I'd marked each one carefully, highlighting dates, timestamps, anything that proved just how deeply she'd betrayed me. As I handed the envelope to the hotel manager, I explained the situation briefly, keeping my tone professional. "Sir, I'm so sorry you've had to go through this," the manager said, his expression sympathetic. "We'll make sure they get it." I nodded, thanking him, feeling a small thrill of satisfaction as I watched him set the packet aside for delivery. With that done, I returned to my room, waiting for the fallout to unfold. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Melanie. "Andrew, I need to talk to you. Please answer." I ignored it, watching as more texts came in, each one more frantic than the last. "Please, Andrew, I don't know what's going on. Just call me." By afternoon, the messages had turned desperate, filled with apologies, pleas for forgiveness, explanations that I didn't even bother reading. I knew the hotel had delivered the packet. I could picture her face as she read through each piece of evidence, realizing just how thoroughly I'd uncovered her lies. But it wasn't until I finally returned home that evening that the gravity of her desperation hit me. She was there, waiting for me on the porch, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling as she approached me. "Andrew, please. I can explain," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I stared at her, letting the silence stretch, savoring the moment. Then I spoke, my voice cold, unyielding. "Explain what, Melanie? Explain how you lied to me, how you threw away everything we had for a fantasy." I could feel the anger boiling up, the betrayal etched into every word. "Or maybe explain why you thought I wouldn't find out?" She sobbed, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away, the disgust clear on my face. "It was a mistake," she cried, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I was thinking. I never wanted to lose you. I was stupid, caught up in the excitement. But it meant nothing compared to you." I almost laughed, the bitterness surging up in me like a wave. "Nothing? Then why were you planning to spend the weekend with him?" I demanded, my voice a harsh whisper. "You were ready to throw everything away for him, weren't you?" She shook her head, desperation filling her eyes. "No, Andrew. I wasn't going to. I was going to end it, I swear. I couldn't do it anymore. I was going to come home to you." But her words were empty, hollow, and I'd already made my decision. "You don't get to come home to me, Melanie. Not anymore." I turned away, stepping toward the door. "I'll be filing for divorce. Pack your things and get out by the end of the week." She collapsed onto the porch, her sobs echoing in the night, but I didn't look back. This was the end of the life we'd built together, a life she destroyed with her own hands. And as I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, I felt an odd sense of relief. A chapter of betrayal and lies had closed, and for the first time, I was free. The days after I told Melanie to leave were a blur of silence and tension. She stayed in the guest room, only coming out when she thought I wouldn't be around. When we did cross paths, she was a shadow of herself. Eyes red from crying, shoulders slumped, as if the weight of what she'd done was finally sinking in. But there was no room left in me for sympathy. I'd replayed our life together in my mind too many times, sifting through years of memories, now tainted by the knowledge that they'd meant less to her than I'd thought. On the third day, she finally gathered her things and left. I watched from the window as she loaded her car, her movements slow and reluctant, as if hoping I'd come out and stop her. But I didn't. When she finally drove away, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and satisfaction. She was gone. The home we'd built together, the life we'd shared, was mine alone now. But the real satisfaction came later, when the details of her affair and our separation inevitably began to spread. Melanie hadn't been quiet about her admiration for Lorenzo at work, and her colleagues had noticed her changing behavior, the long lunches, the late nights. Once the rumors took off, it wasn't long before everything came to light. Their affair, once hidden in whispers and stolen moments, was now the talk of the office. One evening, about a month after she'd moved out, I got a call from Sarah, Melanie's friend and colleague, the one who'd hinted at Lorenzo during our brief chat at the office. She sounded hesitant, almost awkward, but there was a certain relief in her voice. "I just thought you should know," she said. "Lorenzo was fired." The words hung in the air, a mixture of vindication and bitterness settling in my chest. "Fired?" "Yes," she continued, her tone hesitant. "Apparently, it's policy to terminate any employee involved in a relationship with a subordinate. It's become a huge scandal." I could practically see her wincing on the other end, but her words sparked a dark sense of satisfaction within me. Lorenzo, the man who'd swept into Melanie's life with his charm and swagger, had lost everything he'd worked for. And Melanie, who had been enchanted by his allure, was left to pick up the pieces. A week later, I got an unexpected text from Melanie. It was a long, rambling message filled with apologies and regret. Her words a desperate plea for forgiveness. She admitted everything. How she'd been caught up in a fantasy, how she'd been flattered by Lorenzo's attention, how she'd thought she was missing something in her life. But now, facing the consequences of her actions, she realized too late the depth of her mistake. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she wrote, "but I hope one day you'll understand. I was lost, Andrew. I didn't know who I was. I thought I needed something more, but all I ever needed was you. Please, let me make it right." I didn't reply. Her words meant nothing to me now. She destroyed what we had, traded it for a fleeting fantasy, and in the end, she'd been left with nothing. I knew she was struggling. She'd moved back to her parents' house and was looking for a new job, though her reputation in the industry was now tainted by her association with Lorenzo. But my life didn't stop because of her regrets. Slowly, I started putting myself back together. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in years, reconnected with family, threw myself into hobbies I'd long neglected. I started going to the gym, focusing on my health, building myself back up piece by piece. As the months passed, Melanie's texts became less frequent. At first, she'd reached out weekly, then monthly, each message an echo of the last, filled with apologies, pleas for closure, promises to change. But with each ignored message, her voice grew fainter, until eventually, it stopped altogether. I was finally free from the shadow of our broken marriage. One evening, almost a year after she'd left, I bumped into Sarah again at a mutual friend's party. We hadn't spoken since she'd told me about Lorenzo's firing, but that night, she seemed eager to catch up, her eyes shining with an energy that was contagious. "Andrew, you look incredible," she said, smiling warmly. "It's like you've become a whole new person." I felt a flicker of pride, and for the first time, a genuine smile crossed my face. "Thanks, Sarah. I guess I'm finally moving on." She raised her glass, her eyes twinkling. "To new beginnings, then. You deserve it." We spent the rest of the evening talking, laughing over old stories and new plans. And as I drove home that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of Melanie's betrayal finally lifting. The life we'd shared had been built on trust, and though she'd broken that trust, I realized now that it didn't define me. I'd come out stronger, more sure of myself than I'd ever been. And for the first time, I felt ready to start over, on my own terms, in my own time. Melanie's chapter was closed, and my life was an open book, ready for the next page. Epilogue. A lesson in loss. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that Melanie had moved to another city, trying to rebuild her life from the ashes of her choices. She'd lost nearly everything: her job, her relationship, the trust of friends and colleagues. But none of it mattered to me now. The pain she'd caused had once felt insurmountable, but I had risen above it, emerging from the wreckage of our marriage as a stronger, better man. Looking back, I saw her betrayal for what it was, a moment of weakness that had cost her dearly, but it had also given me the gift of a second chance. And as I stepped into my new life, I carried with me a hard-won lesson: that sometimes losing everything you thought you needed is the only way to discover what you truly deserve.